On May 12, 2026, at 7:30 in the evening, the federal government dropped the biggest change to property tax in Australia in over a decade. 6 weeks later, on June 25th, it passed both houses of Parliament and became law. Here's the part almost nobody caught. Buried in the fine print is a gap that could strip a grieving widow or someone going through a divorce of tax protections they thought were locked in for life. Treasury didn't design it this way on purpose, but right now, today, it's sitting there in the legislation, and investors across Sydney and Melbourne are scrambling to understand what it means for them. Let's break down what actually changed, who it protects, and who just got left exposed. Quick thing before we get into it. If you're a homeowner, an investor, or you're just trying to figure out what this market's doing next, hit subscribe now. We're breaking down every one of these policy changes as they land, and this one's moving fast.
Here's the headline change. Starting July 1st, 2027, negative gearing on established homes is done. If you buy an existing house or apartment after that date, you can no longer use rental losses to offset your salary. Losses can still be carried forward against future rental income or a future capital gain, but the old trick of using an investment property to cut your income tax bill on established homes is going away. The capital gains tax discount is changing too. Right now, investors get to knock 50% off their taxable gain when they sell. Under the new law, that flat discount gets replaced with an inflation-indexed method, and a minimum 30% tax applies to real gains from July 2027 onward. Now here's where it gets interesting. The government didn't want to punish people who already bought under the old rules, so anyone who owned an established investment property before 7:30 p.m. on May 12, 2026 is grandfathered in. Same goes for anyone who was already under contract that night. New builds are exempt entirely, so investors can still get negative gearing and the 50% discount on those going forward. According to the Treasurer's Office, the changes are meant to level the playing field for wage earners and first home buyers. The government says the reform will push total housing investment to a record $47 billion and pair it with the expanded 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers. Critics on the other side, including the Greens, have called it tinkering around the edges, arguing it hands billions in ongoing benefits to existing investors while doing little for renters. Both sides agree on one thing. The line in the sand is May 12, 2026. Everything hinges on which side of that date your property sits.
Here's where the story turns. A couple who bought an investment property years before that budget night did everything right. They're grandfathered. They keep negative gearing and the old CGT discount for as long as they hold the property, no matter what happens to prices or interest rates. But what happens if one of them dies, or the marriage ends and the property gets transferred as part of a settlement? Under the legislation as written, that grandfathering can simply evaporate. A jointly owned property that shifts to single ownership through death or divorce isn't automatically protected. Two people who followed the rules for a decade could suddenly find themselves treated as new buyers under the tougher post-2027 tax regime through no decision of their own. Independent Senator David Pocock raised the issue directly in the Senate. Finance Minister Katie Gallagher confirmed the government is aware of the problem and has promised a fix in what's being called a second tranche of legislation, expected later this year. Until that second bill actually passes, the gap is real, and it's already being called the widow's tax by advisors working through the fallout with clients. Property lawyers and wealth planners say the safest move right now is documentation. Get advice before anything changes hands, not after, because right now this isn't hypothetical, it's a live risk sitting in current law.
Let's get into the data, because the numbers explain why this is landing so hard in Sydney and Melbourne specifically. CoreLogic's National Home Value Index fell 0.4% in June 2026, the steepest monthly drop in 3.5 years. Sydney and Melbourne led that decline, down 1.2% and 0.1% for the month. Over the full June quarter, Sydney fell 3.2% and Melbourne fell 2.6%, while Perth, Adelaide and Brisbane kept posting gains. Sydney's median dwelling value sits above $1.29 million. Melbourne's is around $828,000. Sales volumes in Sydney were tracking 17% lower than a year earlier, and Melbourne's were down 14% year-on-year, with listings running above their long-term average in both cities. That's a textbook buyer's market forming in real time. On the super side, the new Division 296 tax adds a 15% charge on earnings for super balances above $3 million, and it counts unrealised gains, not just money actually pocketed. Land tax has moved too. In New South Wales, an investor holding around $5 million in taxable land value can now face an annual bill north of $60,000, whether or not the property's even rented out.
So, how are investors actually responding? A few patterns are showing up. Self-managed super funds used to be able to borrow money to buy an established investment property through what's called a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. That loophole has now been closed entirely for established properties. SMSF trustees are being pushed toward new builds or toward assets outside property altogether. Wealth advisors are also talking openly about geo-allocation. Spreading land holdings across 2 or 3 states can sometimes keep an investor under each state's land tax threshold, instead of concentrating value in one state and getting hit with the higher stacked rate. It's a legal strategy, but it shows how much structuring is now happening purely around tax thresholds, rather than where the good properties actually are. And with super balances above $3 million now facing that extra Div 296 hit, some planners are steering high net worth clients away from overfunding super entirely and toward family trusts or insurance bonds instead. Meanwhile, on the ground, agents in both cities describe a market that's genuinely cooled. Auction clearance rates have slipped below 50% in parts of Sydney and Melbourne. Buyers are far more selective, and sellers who were confident 6 months ago are adjusting price expectations fast. As of right now, in July 2026, here's where things stand. The core law is passed and locked in. The negative gearing and CGT changes take effect July 1st, 2027. Existing owners are protected, new builds are protected, but the widow's tax gap in the grandfathering rules has not yet been fixed. That fix is still sitting in a promised second bill with no confirmed date. Economists are split on where prices go from here. ANZ has downgraded its 2026 capital city growth forecast to 2.8%. Westpac IQ now expects prices to sit flat nationally for the year, with Sydney and Melbourne recording outright declines. CBA expects a similar flat patch before a modest recovery into 2027. For anyone holding property in Sydney or Melbourne right now, jointly owned or inside an SMSF, this is the moment to actually check where your paperwork stands, not wait until something forces the question.
That's why homeowners, renters and investors across Sydney and Melbourne are all watching this one closely right now. A tax reform sold as fixing housing affordability has quietly created a new risk for the exact families it wasn't supposed to touch. And until that second bill lands, nobody knows exactly how it gets fixed. If you found this useful, subscribe for the next update the moment that second tranche of legislation drops.